Hello, hello, and welcome to Found in Interpretation podcast. Once again, I am your co-host Alain Breton, and I'm here once again with Brian. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing okay. Trying to survive the busy season.
Yeah, it is busy these days, quite right.
It is exhausting, but it's fun. It's good that we love what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to have passion for everything that we do. There's a lot of things going on in the world. May that be war, all kinds of debate, left, right, up, down, center, name it. As interpreter, as you said, Brian, several times, we have to be Switzerland because being an interpreter, I think, requires a nuanced understanding of linguistic subtleties and the political environment, right?
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, we've been saying that we were like Switzerland. We've been saying that we need to be neutral and stuff, and we've been pretty loosey goosey about terms because really, like the point of our podcast up to this point haven't been about being impartial and neutral. It's more about like having guests talk about something specific in a field. But I think it's important to take that step back and say, like, listen, like, yes, we are neutral, but is it neutral or is it impartial? Because neutral is more like, say, like AI, where they speak in a monotone voice and they say everything that the other person says and there's no inflection whatsoever. Or do we do the impartial one where people are like motivated about what they have to say, even though you don't necessarily agree with them, but you still have to have the same tone and inflection as the other person? So I think in the big world, in the big scheme of things, I think it's important to be impartial. But at the same time, like according to our code of ethics, it's not just important, it's our responsibility.
Yeah. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to translate for someone you really disagreed with? And how do you deal with that?
All the time. Yeah. And I'm
You
gonna
don't agree with many people? That's what you're
no, I
saying?
don't.
We
Yeah,
get
pretty
along.
much. There's a lot of people who like, like I don't know, man. Like, but like, yeah,
No
and
names.
we're not. I mean, we both know we've spoken in private, and that's fine to be able to give that bias privately. But if you're on the job and everything, it's important to be careful with that bias. Not only that bias, but the unconscious bias. Like the ones where, like, because we all grow up a certain way and we believe certain things and things like that. And sometimes, like, people do have this unconscious bias and it does permeate through society. Like, for example, like if someone's ultra conservative and then there's a very liberal topic and you're like, oh my God, I don't agree with this stuff at all, or vice versa. Or like if someone like shows up, there's the whole concept of the deadbeat dad that shows up to court, for child support and all this stuff. So like there's all these things that you're kind of predisposed to in life, and that you have to make sure as an interpreter that you're not bringing that baggage with you. And so like some of the examples that I would give is, for starters, well, let's look at the prime minister. Let's dive
You mean
right in there.
Prime Minister of Canada?
Yes, let's talk about.
Because this is a show, by the way, to our American audience. Canada does not have a president, but a prime minister.
Absolutely, yes. And our prime minister, his name is Justin Trudeau. And the first time that I interpreted for him was before he was prime minister. So he was with the Trudeau Foundation, which was set up by his
Before he
father.
was an MP.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Before he was even in politics, he was as part of the Trudeau Foundation. He was a member of the board. Yeah, my opinion of him at the time was, wow, this guy, he speaks well. He's a good speaker. Like he gave a great presentation. I was able to follow. He's great sentences, not like other politicians that we have nowadays that can't finish a sentence. Like he was very good, very eloquent, and I was like, man, this guy, I think maybe he's gonna get into politics. And then, sure enough, now he's our prime minister. But yeah, like my point of view of him has changed throughout the years, but that doesn't mean that my interpretation will change throughout the years.
When you need to say something you profoundly disagree with, does it have an impact psychologically? And let me explain what I mean. I think as human beings, we naturally, most of us at least, tell the truth.
Yes.
Whatever comes out of our mouth is something we believe in, something that may that be an opinion or a thought or anything else, but it's always how we perceive the world, how we perceive our own truth.
Hmm.
But when we're interpreting, we are basically telling other people's truth. And these other people's truth are not our own truth. So I think that it's very challenging for the mind, at least in my case. It's very challenging to spend sometimes a whole day or even a whole week saying things honestly, vividly, but that I don't believe in. And I think that at the end of the day, I am much more exhausted than if I had agreed with that same speech. And I think that mentally this has an impact, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's important to keep the same attitude maybe that Ahmed has when he was talking to us about the International Criminal Court, where like I'm not that person is what he said, right? Like I didn't have the same past, I didn't have the same experiences, like I'm not a refugee, I'm not a political leader. I didn't witness all of these atrocities, so it's important to take that step back and be like, okay, well, I don't believe in this, and I'll find something to do to clear my mind after I'm done my contract. But for the time being, this is what I have to do. But I agree with you; it's exhausting to be interpreting for someone where you're like, oh my god, what is coming out of my own mouth? I mean, I like no. I did a conference once where someone was talking about the LGBTQ community, and they were talking about why they were completely against that. And one of the sentences that one of the people that were there said was like, well, if we legalize this, then what's next? Are we going to legalize people having sex with sheep? And I was like, oh my god. And I'm interpreting, and I'm in a Spanish booth, so I'm looking at my French colleague and in the French booth, and then my Polish colleague on the Polish booth, and we're like, I can't believe we just said that sentence.
Does it happen to you where you say something and you say it, and after you think, did I really just say that? I hope I haven't made some kind of mistake. Did I really just say that? Oh my God, maybe I'll get in trouble because I said something completely wrong. And then you find out later on in the speech that this is really what you said.
Yeah, that's really what we said. And it goes back to maybe our first or second podcast when we were talking about the Nuremberg trials, where people were like, my God, did you really say that? And then they have to go back and they repeat it, and they're like, yes, this is exactly what happened, because people could not believe what atrocities happened during the Second World War. But I think at the same time, like there's a bit of a balance when you get to interpret people you like. So I think that mental, yeah, even like that like you could be very depressed very quickly if you keep on interpreting the same thing over and over, like if it's something that you don't believe in, right? But like at least there's like those little like silver linings where you're like, okay, I'll interpret for example, I did a conference in 2006 where Bill Clinton was there. And whether you agree with Bill Clinton's politics or not, the guy has a aura about him when he walks into a room where everything stands
He's an
still and
excellent
he
speaker.
excellent. Yeah, excellent speaker, excellent, and like the message was very nice, very kind. It was at the a time in his life when he was a big philanthropist and giving back, and like it was a very positive message. And that those are the kind of things that kind of give you energy as an interpreter to continue going forward. I think another example would be when I interpreted Juan Manuel Santos, the Colombian president or ex-Colombian president, and he negotiated a peace agreement with the FARC, the revolutionary guerrillas in Colombia, and that was like historic. It was never, no one ever thought this would happen, and so Juan Manuel Santos was explaining how he accomplished that, and after that, subsequently got the Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm like, yeah, like this. There's some people like again, like regardless as to whether you are a big believer in their politics, if they're left, if they're right, if they're center, like you said, up or down. So like, yeah, like there are some people where there's like the silver lining where you're like, oh my God, this is such an awesome message, so powerful, so inspiring, you know?
Yeah. And the thing is, as interpreters, we don't get to choose. It's really unexpected.
Unless you're Steven and you get to pick between Trump and Biden. Which I'm like, pick your poison.
But you still had to choose. Maybe that was the
Yes,
problem.
but I think it wasn't for them. It wasn't really the political side. It's like who is easier to interpret for.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. It wasn't, yeah, he didn't say it according to a political preference. It
No,
was really about which one is going to be a bit more eloquent and easy to do.
yeah, exactly. And he was like, "Oh my God, why did I have to pick Biden?" I think it was. I think
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah. He
Biden,
said, but
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
he had Biden.
But
So
yeah, but I mean, like we have that all the time, and even
so we don't get to choose the assignment.
no, we don't. We don't get to choose. Like, I mean, this guy Juan Manuel Santos was a guest speaker for an economic forum, right? So, like, even at that, you're like, why is he here? Why is he a guest speaker? And it turned out that like Colombia was opening its doors to be able to improve its infrastructure, needed a foreign aid to be able to do that, like to build the ports and the airports and the railway system and everything. So that was kind of like an intro to um, the Minister of Finance that went on and said, like, listen, like we would like some foreign aid so we can, because we have all these projects in mind. We have so many natural resources, we just can't get them from point A to point B. So we need some help. So yeah, and that's where it's very important too to understand the cultural context, which
And
I
I
don't
think
think.
that, have you ever seen an interpreter change slightly the content in order to, I would say, in their opinion, correct something, but that's not what was said, but you sort of figure out that it was because of their own political opinion?
Well, there were two cases, I think, and it was when I was a freelancer. So I was working for an agency and I didn't really have control on who I was working with. So the first case, it was an interpreter who we were interpreting for the Minister of Finance of Niger, and he was telling basically the rest of the world, like we need some foreign aid, we need your assistance, and we have a crisis, so we need your just some foreign aid to be able to get out of this. And he interpreted it as, we need your help, like that's it. And I was like, we need the world's help. And I'm like, oh my god, like I wanted to hide under the table because I'm like, no, they need foreign aid, like they don't need your help, like that's so broad and like it doesn't mean anything, right? So yeah, so unfortunately that was a case where I was just like,
And in the end, they had no help whatsoever.
well, that's the thing, right? Like if you're not explicit and translate a message or interpret a message faithfully, then that's one of the dangers, right? Like help with what? Like is there like a famine? Is it like infrastructure? Is it this? Is it that? Is there a war going on like that we don't know about? So yeah, it was quite shaky. And the other one I think I already I mentioned it once. I think it was a LGBTQ community, and the person just refused to say anything that was sexual because it was against his religion.
Yeah, it happens to me every once in a while where I did a conference a few months ago here in Quebec City, and there was a topic, that was in regards to either sexual orientation or sexual education. And without getting into the specifics, but the point was that whenever there was a small break in the speech, the other interpreter was like, blah 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 blah, and I was like, "Hmm, okay, yes, okay,
People were
keep,
wondering
yeah,
like why there's heavy breathing in
yeah."
the booth.
Well, and we're in the back, and we only see the back of people's head. So I'm like, okay, luckily, we're not next. We're not at an angle where people can see us. Usually, we're at the very back of the huge conference room, so
Yes.
it's sort of okay. But imagine if someone had peeked at us, and it was like, what is going on in that booth?
Yeah, absolutely. Like yeah, and it could be anything. It could be like a political thing, just like Israel Palestine. Like someone who speaks pro Israel, or someone who speaks pro Palestine, and you're completely in the other side. You're like,
Oh, in the same week, last year, in the same week, I had a pro Palestinian and a pro Israel,
mm-hmm,
and I'm Quebecois, and I don't know the conflict, very. I mean, I know what I see in the news, but I don't get to live there, and I haven't visited the place, and I don't know anyone actually from either side. And I'm Team Human, and and I was I it was kind of funny because my feeling after one speech, I was like, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, okay, I think I can. And then a few days later, I do the exact opposite, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, they brought some good. And then and then after that, and I'm like, I go back home, have my glass of wine, and I'm thinking, Why am I thinking two things at the same time that are completely opposite? I don't even understand myself.
Yeah, I mean that's the big challenge for us too. Like there's another example is like the Ukraine Russia conflict. So I had the pleasure of interpreting for the ambassador of Ukraine in Canada, and she was talking about democracy and how this affects democracy. And there was a journalist that was there, and the journalist was saying like, listen, like I don't think we're there's a fear in what's happening more than there's like a more laissez-faire approach. Like when Chechnya was invaded, not much happened, like on an international scale. So that I think that kind of laissez-faire approach is like, oh yeah, like now we can come into Ukraine, and then if nobody does anything else, then where's next? Like this is where the big threat to democracy is into the Western world. Like where does it stop? And I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. Like, so it didn't matter really if you're pro Ukraine or pro Russia or pro Israel, pro Palestine. Like just to listen to these people speak so eloquently about their point. I think that's a source of inspiration too. And like I said, like yeah, you can talk about a topic that you disagree with vehemently and be like all depressed at the end of the day
Yeah.
and exhausted, like you said. But then there's these silver linings, you know, like where like they're like, man, this person like really knows what they're talking about, and like it's so inspirational.
Yeah, but sometimes I mean, what you're saying right now makes me think of one time I was doing this I would say presentation by a man that had a sex change. Well, I mean, look, fact checkers, please don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to explain here a situation. I don't want to dead name anyone. But basically, he was a man, and he turns out that in his 40s, he had a sex operation, but he was already in a relationship, and he has two teenage boys. And I was okay. It's not the first time that I have to interpret a situation where someone transitions. And but then he explained that it happened before COVID, and then when COVID hit, basically he lost touch with his own children, and he had some problems with his ex. And when he described what he went through, and when he had to explain the relationship, the new relationship now with his sons and the reactions of his children, I started to have tears suddenly because I was so into his story, and I visualized myself while I was interpreting. I was visualizing myself, and I thought, teenage boys and this, and then what would be their reaction. And then I started seeing in my mind um the face of my own children and how they would react, and then one accepts, the other one no, and the
And the
trouble
rest
in
of
the
your family,
relationship and the
yeah.
rest of the family. I It was like being an actor. It was like being inside of a character. And after that presentation, I was exhausted. I mean, it didn't last long. It was, we were two interpreters. It was a 2-hour session, but at the end, I was glad I didn't have anything else on that day, because I was really, really tired inside from being inside that person's head, because that's what happens a lot when you're interpreting. You really have the chance of entering, and not every presentation, of course, not the latest TD quarterly meeting or something on their stocks or whatever, but every once in a while, you have these presentations where you get in people's head, and then suddenly, whatever the beliefs that we may have, or whatever the misconceptions or preconceptions, I would say, that we have about this, suddenly we enter and we become that person for an instant. And that has a very, very big mental toll.
Absolutely. And I think that like it's so important for us to play that role as interpreters. I think like what you did was exactly what you should do. And I think that if
I'm
somebody,
feeling, just telling you, I'm
yeah,
feeling something
I
right
can feel that
now.
you're feeling
I
that.
I'm feeling that right now.
Yeah.
Still.
Yeah, and I think that if an interpreter can't do that because they're not comfortable with the subject, then they shouldn't be accepting an assignment that has that. Or maybe that's one of the gifts of working with a partner, where maybe the partner will be like, "No, I'm good with it. I'll take over. You give me the mic and I'll do it." Or-
Yeah. What was doing the National Jiu-Jitsu Institute, and there was one time there was a conference on um, wrongful convictions.
Hmm,
And there was a speaker that came, and she came to tell this her story to the judges on how she was wrongly accused. Basically, she was wrongly accused, and she talked about her journey in the judicial system from the moment she was arrested, interrogated, then without really having a good understanding of the situation or English back in those days, she ended up incarcerated for a very, very long time. And my booth partner at that time, she was in tears.
mhm.
Um, and I looked at her and I said, "Do you want me to take over or something?" And she was like, "No, no, no, I can do it." And she held on and she moved forward, but she was really so into it. And actually, we did that wrongful conviction again another year. And once again, my booth partner, she again was with the same booth partner, and she had tears in her eyes. And I was like, okay, okay, this time and again, And but I also did later on, of course. But yeah, emotionally, it can be quite heavy.
Yeah, yeah. No, I did one with well, a few times I've interpreted for Stephen Lewis, and he always has a very
I'm sorry,
um,
Stephen Lewis.
yeah, Stephen Lewis. He's a bit of an international not spokesperson, but he travels around the world and mostly focuses on AIDS in Africa and other
Okay.
causes. So he went to Africa and he was talking about his experience there, and he went with Nelson Mandela's wife Winnie to different places in South Africa, and yeah, and there was a point where all the journalists were following them around, and they got to this little village, and the when he said, "Listen, journalists, cameramen, I'm going to go into this hut with Stephen Lewis. We ask you to respect our privacy at this point." So they went in, and there was I think three girls that were there, and they started talking, and they said, "Well, yeah, no, my parents passed away because of the AIDS crisis, and my grandparents are." Trying to take care of us, but they're not. I mean, they're old, and they can't do the stuff that my parents would have been able to do. And so when he just like straight up and asked the eldest, like, "Have you had your period yet?" And she said, "Oh, yes." So then they had a candid explanation on what that means for a woman, and yeah, so they're like they've never had that parent conversation with like a child and a parent speaking together, and it was so heartwarming that like my colleague again like your situation, she broke down. She's like, "I can't believe like this happened." And it was just story after story of like people losing the war to AIDS and finding themselves orphans or having themselves in the care of the next generation, like the grandparents. Yeah, it's draining both mentally and emotionally. And I think it wears on your physical health too at a certain point, because you're like when you hear those stories, like you don't really feel like going to the gym after.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or maybe you do. Maybe you feel like going and punch a punching bag, just to get rid of your like just the
But
emotions.
you're bringing here a very good point. What do you do to at the end of the day? You just crack a bottle of wine, you go for a jog. What do you do?
I'm not huge on sports. I'd say that the wine is probably more prevalent in my household than a treadmill. So yeah, so I mean yeah, I tried to get it out of my brain because at the end of the day, you're coming home to your wife and your kids, and you don't want to have all that baggage with you, right? So, yeah, you can talk about it, debrief a bit with your partner, and then like it's out of the way. Like then you got to focus on your kids, you got to focus on their homework, you got to focus on all this other stuff, and then like I always read a book at the end of the day before going to bed, so that usually ensures that I'm okay the next day. No more blue lights before I go to bed, that kind of thing. But I think it also raises the question of AI, right? Because we had Olivier over and he talked about Canoe and what he's doing with AI, and I'm like, I know that it wouldn't be able to convey the message the way that we did when we were doing these emotional, like heartwarming or heartbreaking experiences, right?
Yeah, I don't think that AI will be able to really convey the meaning when it's about people, the heart, emotions. I remember a few years ago, before the pandemic, I went to a series of conferences on suicide, and you spend 3 days talking about suicide and people who survived, people who've lost people, what researchers have to say, and all of that. And I'd have a hard time believing that an AI could get emotionally invested in order to accurately deliver the message. And I don't think that people want that. I don't think that people want even a fake, these days, ChatGPT can do, hey, hello, a little bit like the movie Her,
Yeah,
some
yes,
kind
yes.
of all jolly voice. Hey, how you doing today? You're thinking about killing yourself? No, but it's true. You need AI may have intelligence, but it doesn't have judgment, and judgment doesn't equal intelligence. And I think that as interpreter, that is our biggest asset, to be
Absolutely.
able to judge the situation, to read the room, to read the people who are there. We
Hmm.
can't be simply be replaced by machines, because we're not just parrots. We're not parroting into another language. We do a lot more than just repeating other people's words. We're not actually. We're analyzing, reformulating, choosing our words carefully, making sure there's no diplomatic incident, whatever the scale. And I'm still, again, on team human.
Yes, I'm on. I have to agree with you on that one too. Even though we were supposed to be Switzerland about everything, like we said at the beginning of the show, but I
I
do
can't be
think
Switzerland with them against the machine. I'm sorry. I say, okay, I've chosen, you know what? Left, right, up, down. But when it comes to AI and human, I'm always on team human.
we're the rage and they're the machine. So
Exactly.
we're raging against the
Rage
machine.
against the machine. That's right.
Actually, one of my favorite bands, but that's beside the point. But so yeah, I mean, like, there's that raises the whole question of all the different things that we can do that AI can not do, maybe yet or ever. We don't know. But one of the things like we were talking about with Ahmed was the cultural competency of being able to deal with people who are refugees, or world leaders who have committed atrocious acts. So you need to know the cultural competence. Like, what is it like to live in that country, in Central African Republic? It's very different than living in the United States or in New Zealand or in Mongolia. Like, so like I think that we still have that in our brains to be able to adapt to that cultural competency. And then we also have the ability to be impartial, like I said, and not neutral. Because neutral is more like, yeah, like you're going to repeat everything in a monotone voice, and like you don't put any of your own preconceived notions in it. And then impartiality is more like, yes, let's continue with the same tone that this person had, and so that it doesn't sound like you're biased. We also have specialized knowledge, like a lot of the terms that are being used by some groups, like we know about it because we became experienced and specialized into that. So when someone calls someone a scab in the union language, that means that somebody crossed the picket line, right? Not someone that's all scabbed up. And does AI know that it's not that, like,
Yeah.
so. And
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, it makes me think of, for instance, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but in English, you will talk about indigenous reserves, right?
mm,
That's the correct term.
yes, now.
Okay. Now,
It's evolved throughout time,
it's
but yeah, I
evolved.
think now
It
it's
wasn't like that before.
no, yes.
But I was told when I first started not to say in French réserve,
Okay.
although it might sound like the English reserve. Now we're talking about communauté autochtone. So it would be like a direct translation of their indigenous communities. Because in French, it doesn't sound good in French, but in English, the term is still accepted. I'm sure on the opposite, there's still some things that are also true. But to have an AI make that distinction, that you know what, into one language you can say that, into the other you can't. And we're in Canada, we're bidirectional.
Yes.
We're not a pure French or English booth. We cross from one language to the next all the time on a click of a button.
Hmm.
I think that it would create a lot of very uncomfortable moments for people to hear the wrong term, especially nowadays where people are extremely careful about what is said, what is perceived, and we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable.
Yes, and that comes back to all of the beginnings of all of our conferences when we do the land acknowledgement. Like, would the AI be able to understand the names of each community that you're working in, and that you're acknowledging that you're working into their territory, that you live on their territory, that you're occupying that space? Does it have that cultural element that, like, yes, Anishinaabe is pronounced this way, and is it going to go try to find some English or French equivalent and just completely butcher the name? So it's dangerous when there's no, like, there isn't that
Yeah, and I think
judgment.
Olivier was saying that his own name can't be pronounced accurately by an AI.
Yeah. Or maybe it'll be the page.
Well, for instance, when an AI reads my name, like my name is Alain Breton, that's more like a French pronunciation. I don't really say Alan, but Alain. I try to, when people meet me for the first time, I introduce myself even in English as Alain. But when let's say Siri or whatever other device hears my name, they'll say Elaine, and I always felt that it sounded like Elaine in Seinfeld.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, it's
Like
very
Elaine sound,
similar.
yeah,
But even Hélène in French, it sounds
right.
Alain, Hélène, it's not far. My when I call my mom on on the phone, the car talks to me, and I'm on when I'm driving, and I'm like, call. I have to say call Mayman on cell instead of maman, because it won't understand maman. It goes, and then it says calling Mayman on cell. Mayman, that sounds terrible.
It's like when you're driving in Montreal with Google Maps, and like you're like, get me the direction of Boulevard René Lévesque. Like René Lévesque.
Searching for Renilla Vesky.
That's
Revesky.
And then sometimes you're like, how do I pronounce this for Google to understand? Or sometimes they get a direction to Levesky. I'm like, what?
So I think to come back to our original topic, the one on politics and being able to be unbiased in politics, I think what we've come to the conclusion with is that this applies to everything in life, like for interpreters. Like, I think that's basically the message that you and I have been trying to convey for the last 36 minutes, is that it does apply to other fields. Like, we talked about the deadbeat dad. Like, everyone has a pre-assumption when you go into court and you're like asking to pay the minimal amount of child support or something like that, that there's going to be this preconceived unconscious bias. And that's the danger that interpreters can fall into, and how, like, what we're trying to tell you as maybe a new interpreter, try not to fall into those traps and try to be conscious of your own unconscious bias, because you never know. Like, maybe you grew up in a very liberal family in Canada, and always lived in the same town, always saw the same people, as opposed to somebody who maybe came from a different country and had to forcefully leave that country to come into your country, and then they have their own baggage. But, like, the two of them are completely different, but you have to be able to realize that as an interpreter, you need to separate your own beliefs and be able to have that and realize when you're doing it so you don't make that mistake. Because then our goal, like we said this whole time, is that we need to be impartial. We need to be able to give the message as faithfully as possible.
And what do you do if I remember when I was doing the master's program, they asked us what would we do if, let's say, we had to interpret for, without even knowing beforehand, let's say a terrorist message, something that, let's say, you would be spreading hate, or let's say a terrorist act or something like that. What's what would you do?
Yeah, like where's the limit, right? Like,
Exactly. Where's the line?
yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think for interpreters there is one. I think you have to, because in my mind, I'm like, I need to make sure this is accurate, because there's going to be people in the world that need to do something about this. So it's important to become that voice that said these hateful things or these threatening things against humanity. And it's important to convey the same message, because if, when it comes down to it, somebody, the right authorities, the right people, will need to listen to that message as faithfully as possible so they can do something about
Yeah, because basically what you're saying is that it's not our job to judge. I mean, we have to have judgment, but we there is a line we don't cross because we still convey the message.
it. Yeah, I mean, and like when it comes down to it, don't shoot the messenger, right? They always say that. So like, we're not the ones who are saying that. It's, yes, it's our voice, but no, it's not our message. It's the message of somebody else, another party. So that's important to keep in mind too. Like, and it's not, it doesn't, just because we interpret for Trump or Trudeau or Poilievre or whoever, it doesn't mean that we are supporting that party. We are just their voice at that time when they need it. And for other people who need to listen to the message. That's not, that doesn't show our political affiliation. However, like I said, if you do have that, if you do show that bias, then there's a problem.
Yeah, I think you won't. If it's reported, then you won't be hired again. Basically,
Absolutely, yeah.
well, it's a level of trust, because in your case, you have an agency.
Hmm.
So if you hear out some interpreter skipping segments, not because of a lack of ability, but because it's a choice,
Yes.
you would have to intervene because it's your agency and your name's on the line as well.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's one of the benefits of AI, is that it won't discriminate those things. Maybe it will just say the, like, literally translate what is being said without any like inflection or anything like that. Maybe that's one of the uses for it, where like, it's so, I mean, I can't think of a situation where it's so horrible that the machine's gonna have to do it instead of me. But I mean, you never know. Like,
But it'll be doing it in a happy voice,
yes, it'll be there.
in a happy and jolly voice.
I would like Morgan Freeman, maybe. I already said this before. I think he has a very soothing voice. I'll meet his demands, only if it's with his voice. But yeah, but I mean, like, we talked about the political system. We talked a little bit about the court system, and that there again, it's important, because everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? So like, if you go in there as an interpreter with your bias that, like, oh my God, I know what this guy did, he's so guilty, and like, it shows in your voice, then there's gonna be, it could be cause a mistrial, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah, or like, I think I gave the example. I think it was with Stephen, where there was this wonderful old 75-year-old interpreter who was like so like nice and everything, and she was doing this criminal trial for this horrible dude, and the lawyer was like, I'm sure like they did like that. The jury was like, so they didn't give them
They
as
were
much.
persuaded by the old lady.
Exactly. They're like, oh my gosh, she's so sweet. Like, whereas like, no, no, you shouldn't be looking at me. You should be looking at this guy who did such horrible things. But that, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the court interpretation system requires a whole podcast of its own. So
Oh, yeah, totally.
we'll have to invite someone from the Court Interpreters Association
Well,
or
I have
something.
someone in mind. But speaking of court, and maybe I'll have time for one last anecdote. I did court interpretation, and In the beginning, I didn't know the case because I was not there on the first day. The procedure had already started, and I just arrived in the middle of it because it goes on for several days
Mhm.
or months, rather.
Yeah.
And in the very beginning, I saw the accused, and I was like, okay, you try to analyze quickly the situation, but as the case was being explained, I started thinking, oh my God, this guy. And then I started feeling some anger toward that guy. Oh my God, what did he do? And I started thinking, and then when I started to interpret, be neutral, be like you said so many times, be Switzerland. Okay, be faithful, both, whatever side. And then I passed the microphone to my boothmate, and I'm like, what did he do? Ugh.
It's amazing how you can switch, eh? Like just like it's like as soon as you're interpreting, you're like, okay, here we go. But yeah, no, again, like I said at the beginning, I think I'll repeat this one last time before we sign off. But yeah, it's not just important; it's our professional responsibility to remain neutral and impartial and avoid either conscious or unconscious biases when we're interpreting in every area imaginable where interpreters are needed, and put our strong personal opinions aside. And if you can't do that, then you're not the right person for that
Yeah,
assignment, right?
and that's part of our ethics code.
Absolutely. So
All
until
right, on that
next time,
note.
you want to sign us out?
All right. So thank you very much again, Brian, for this very interesting discussion. And I hope that everyone else out there found it also entertaining. So, everyone, we are on Spotify, we are on YouTube. We'll see each other again in a week from now. All right.
Absolutely.
Good night and good luck.
Take care, everyone.